Welcome back. Sorry about that. I didn't realize how long this video was turning into. So we finished up by reading the passages on the screen. Go to the next highlight. So who could have been such a thorn for Paul and his gospel? Again, we come back to the fact that such a person could only come from Jerusalem. The conflict that informed Paul's letters are best understood not by an argument of silence that attempts to survey the first century Jewish sects of the diaspora, but by understanding the central conflict in his ministry, which was the legitimization of his apostleship, the point at which he could be pricked by the leaders in Jerusalem. At one level, Paul was concerned with the varying styles and opinions of the sects, as when Apollos and Cephas showed up in Corinth, but on a second and more extreme level, he reacted more violently to anyone distorting or adding to his gospel message from the freedom from the law. And when it came to his Gentile converts, he was not going to give an inch. They represented the proof of his gospel mission and Christ's very calling. His message could not fail. So the conflicts again. So where was the thorn in Paul's flesh? Some people try to say that it was some sort of a disease or a handicap. The author here is making the point that it was a person. And he goes through the references in the Tanakh where the thorn in the flesh is usually one of the peoples around Israel. So usually, God uses it as a reference to the Gentiles being a thorn in your flesh, speaking to the Israelites. And so Paul is taking this terminology and he's turning it around. And now he's making the Jewish Christians a thorn in the flesh to his Gentile gospel. So he kind of reversed that role. And the only person that this thorn in the flesh could be would be someone from Jerusalem. That's the only person with the power to delegitimize Paul's apostleship. Moving on, he's speaking about, the return Paul's making to Jerusalem. We get this highlight that almost 15 years had passed and Yeshua had not returned. Paul's churches had overflowed with Gentiles. He was facing not only a theological but also a cultural challenges from his opponents. He was increasingly seen as a maverick apostle, breaking a social contract or the law with his fellow Jewish Christians. He was still connected in part via the temple to the ancient Jewish faith, and so his dangerous message could no longer be tolerated. Although James, Peter, and John might have gone along with Paul earlier, they would do so no longer. In Paul's first letters, he seems to show cracks in his armor. His tone seems like that of a man losing a long and difficult struggle. Through years spent behind bars and at war with his own people, Paul believed in his gospel, but he never wanted to split the church. Though he struggled for his independence, he always knew what Elohim's kingdom could be only in Jerusalem, and for his mission to be valid, it would have to include James. This knowledge caused Paul to do something dramatic. Sometime after his second letter to the Corinthians, he decided, even without invitation, to turn back from his Gentile mission to the west and head back to Jerusalem with his collection. Got a footnote here at the bottom of the page. Paul, in his defense, revealed they were Hebrews, apostles, aware of his collection and carrying letters of condemnation. So this is back at 242, which I don't see the highlight for 242. It's 44. Since Paul did not give their names in his letters, we can make an informed guess based on the descriptions we have. These false apostles would be, of course, the apostles themselves. He referred to them possibly as superlative apostles, a name that sounds much like the pillars of Galatians. If superlative and pseudo-apostles were the same group, they would also qualify in Paul's mind as messengers of Satan. So again, this is reinforcing my own understanding that the pseudo-apostles, the messengers of Satan, the super-apostles, that these were all sarcastic terms that Paul was referring to the followers of James, Kepha, and John. In all likelihood, Paul was writing of those in Jerusalem seeking to undermine him. No one else would have the authority to do so and be threatened by him except those who had the only claim to authority that he lacked, the early Christians out of Jerusalem with their historical knowledge of Yeshua. And then it gives you some references that you can read. In light of this, he mentioned in Paul's claim that he had no room for personal rivalries, and there's some references to other books. This highlight at the bottom of the page, letters of condemnation. What did it mean for Jerusalem to write them in terms of the authority of the carriers? Did it mean the carriers would then speak in the name of the one who sent him? It is important to point out that Paul offered in defense that he, unlike these apostles, did not require letters of commendation. He says his converts alone were his commendations, reiterating his themes that the sources of authority for him came from Elohim in the work he did with Gentiles, not humans. So this also lines up with what I said in my videos, is that these letters of commendation that Paul is seeking for, he is trying to subvert the whole argument. And he's trying to make this rhetorical argument that he doesn't need letters of commendation because the people themselves are his letters. And essentially he's just being defensive about the fact that he doesn't have them. And the only person with the authority to make these letters was James. And then you read the Nazarene Acts of the Apostles, and the only person in there that Kepha says has authority to give these letters of commendation is James. So I believe Kepha's exact words were to accept no teacher unless he comes with letters of recommendation from James, or whoever comes after him, whoever the bishop is that replaces James at his death. For those of you that have heard me speak about the rhetorical devices used by Paul, this is a footnote that I highlighted. If you want more information about that, Stour's rereading of Romans for Paul's usage of various rhetorical devices in the letters to the Romans, the apostrophe, the interlocutor, and the dialogue. So that might be an interesting book if you want or more information about that. So this is speaking about Paul going to Jerusalem and meeting with James. It says, Paul returned to James, but we are not privy to their conversation. Instead, must determine prior cause and effect events from our knowledge of the end results. The main result being that James did not accept the collection, at least not directly. If we follow the story from Acts, James, when offered the money, suggested Paul take his collection to the temple and take the Nazirite vow with 7 days of prayer, abstaining from wine, shaving of his head as a final demonstration to all Jews that he was still faithful. I'm not sure where he gets the 7 days of prayer that would be required. I don't know that that was part of the Nazirite vow, but James told Paul that he should use the collection not for his original purpose, which was to support James and the others, but instead to support the purity rights of 4 other men taking their Nazirite vows. So it sounds to the author that James did not accept the money. I don't think he did either. It sounds to me like he was redirecting it. So this other footnote, the more cynical view might be that James was washing his hands of Paul and his Gentile movement, and even setting up Paul. Speaking about sending Paul into the temple, I'm the cynic. That's my view. I think that James and the Jerusalem assembly was basically sending Paul into the lion's den. Our knowledge of Roman governance, now this is when the Roman soldiers rescued Paul. Our knowledge of Roman governance would suggest that a tribune actively meddling in Jewish affairs sparked by one man's false doctrine was highly unlikely. Yet mob violence raised to a level that could destabilize the city would bring down an iron hand. In this case, the historical claim in Acts does register as true, where Luke claims that Paul called out for help as a Roman citizen and exercised his right that might lead to a fair trial, which is a theme linking the episodes in the book of Acts. Again, my point of view is that Paul was a Herodian and that the Roman soldiers were watching him and came to his rescue because of his status. Not because he was just an ordinary Roman citizen, but because he was a relative of Herod Agrippa, the king of Jerusalem. Why was Paul a proud Jewish Christian and outcast at the temple while other apostles were able to worship there daily without trouble? Why was he different from James or Peter or John? Did they not all agree on the core message of Yeshua the Messiah? James was well respected in the Jewish community, as indicated by his moniker, James the Just. And this is something that I've mentioned before. James the Just, the Zadik, is a Jewish term. Even today you hear Jews talk about the Zadik as being the ultimate pinnacle of righteousness, that you want to live your life in a way that the other Jews will call you the Zadik. And so James had this moniker. It's a very, very Jewish moniker, James HaSadik. So why is it that the same, if you look at their enemies, who was it that put James to death? Well, the same person that put Yeshua to death, the religious establishment. Who was it that protected Paul? Well, the religious political establishment. The same, they had opposite enemies. Now, who was it that tried to put Paul to death? Well, it was the common people on the street. Who was it that loved and protected Yeshua and James? The common people on the street. So Paul's enemies were James's friends, and James's enemies were Paul's friends. The writer of Acts, whose agenda was to show a unified mission, had to include Paul's returning to Jerusalem, which was a historical event, but couldn't interpret the event in ways that would reveal any wrongdoings. If the Jewish Christian church in Jerusalem permitted a Gentile-inclusive Messianic movement preached not only by Paul but also by James, Peter, and John, why all the violence toward Paul? According to these apostles, it seemed Paul's new law-free gospel for the Gentiles was equated with a disobedience to Moses and the law, rendering such a gospel a severe threat to all Jews. So again, you can see, if you read between the lines in Paul's letters and in the book of Acts, you can see that he was teaching a different gospel. It's just that church theology and Messianic Hebraic roots theology has obfuscated that fact, but it's true nonetheless. Here's another reference. Why does it keep moving? Kemuel, Introduction to the New Testament, for mention of Barrett's conclusion that Luke made a conscious decision to pass over in silence the opposition of the primitive church against the Gentile mission, which may be inferred from Paul because only in this way could he visibly connect the Gentile mission with Yeshua. It would not have been well received that there were two clashing factions in early Christianity, which ended with a bloodied Paul on the temple floor. Would it force readers to, as it would today, to question the authority or even origins of Paul's message if he were at the least abandoned by Yeshua's own brother? The narrative construction of Luke Acts and its intention show Paul as the head of an ever-expanding movement whose ultimate destiny was Rome. We cannot help but be suspicious as two main facts are missing. One, we have no ending to the story and do not know if Paul reached his destiny, unlike the Aeneid, after which Acts was modeled, also given the ending of Acts without the connection, and in light of the conflict and Paul's fear, there was no reason to return to Jerusalem. For legal reasons, the Jerusalem Christians would have had for keeping the collection secret. So I guess the questions are, why was the collection not mentioned in Acts? And I think a better question is, why is it that when Paul was in prison, there's no mention of James or Peter or anyone coming to visit him? There's lots of mentions of Herodians and the Roman establishment coming to visit Paul, but there's no mention of any of the Jewish Christians coming to his aid. It almost sounds like once Paul was taken into protective custody of the Herodians, that the other apostles just kind of abandoned him. Also here at the bottom of the page, it is significant that his accusers were from Asia, returned for the Passover, and still were aware of Paul's supposed misdeed and willing to report him to the mother church. We see already a history with the Ephesian synagogue undermining the polis. The riot reads like a riot in Ephesus. Perhaps the attack in Jerusalem involved some of the beasts he mentioned in 1 Corinthians. So essentially, the people from Ephesus, the people from Asia that saw Paul in the temple, they were the people that knew what Paul was teaching. They were eyewitnesses to it, and they were the very people that rose up against Paul. So it doesn't really bode well for Paul being proved innocent of his Torah-less teaching. Also, this author Dunn points out when Paul was arrested and put on trial, we hear nothing of any Jewish Christians standing by him speaking in his defense, and despite James' apparent high standing among Orthodox Jews, where was the Jerusalem Christians? It looks very much as though they had washed their hands of Paul, left him to stew in his own juice. If so, it implies a fundamental antipathy on the part of the Jewish Christians to Paul himself and what he stood for. So this is what I just said. Why did the Jewish Christians not come to Paul's defense? It's almost like they abandoned him. The truth is, Paul and Yeshua had fundamentally different messages about how one was to enter the kingdom. For Yeshua, it was by following the law, and for Paul, it was by believing in Jesus, in Yeshua. For Jewish believers, almost everyone but Paul, there was no conflict between the age of the Messiah and the following of the Torah. So again, this is just pointing out that Paul was teaching a different gospel than Yeshua or the apostles did. What Paul called my gospel was what he first had received and preached to others, even though it was a minority view and was rejected before his final visit with the collection. Even so, it would later become the core message placed on the lips of Yeshua in the Gospels. The fact that Paul claims as sworn testimony the fact that he obtained his gospel through revelation and not in Jerusalem made it impossible for him to have been commissioned. So this is speaking about the letters of commendation. I mean, if he didn't get his doctrine from the Jerusalem assembly, why would they be giving him a letter of commendation? He couldn't have been commissioned by them. Paul becomes, in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, the Paul you find in Acts, not the Paul you find in his letters. And the church built on Luke's foundational story at the expense of Paul's struggle, which was trapped beneath, so much so that Paul's letters eventually followed the Gospels and Acts of the Apostles in the order of the Bible. So in other words, when we read Paul's letters, we read them through the lens of thinking that he was the Paul in Acts. But the Paul in Acts is kind of the watered-down, family-friendly version of Paul. But you get to see the real Paul in his own letters, where he is fighting against the Jewish Christians themselves. The other Christian voices, including those of the Jerusalem Christians who knew the historical Yeshua best, are no longer heard. Instead, what remains is an official church established with Paul as her spokesperson, girded by the Gospels and the Luke-Acts story of Paul. So I would recommend watching my series on the Pythagorean connection in Luke-Acts. I think that there's a code in Luke-Acts that actually is anti-Paul. So on the surface, Luke appears to be writing in a very pro-Paul position, but if you know the code, if you know how to decipher his words, then you can see what's really being said behind the scenes. But nevertheless, this book, I actually thought it was a good book. I enjoyed reading it. There is a video. I haven't seen the video yet, but it might be worth checking out. The Apostle Paul, A Polite Bribe. I think that reading this book and watching my series on What's Up with Galatians will give you a really thorough understanding of what's going on with Paul. And once you get that information, you should be able to sit back and ask yourselves, is Paul a legitimate apostle? Is there something going on here that we don't know about? And from that point, make your decision about who to follow. Quit just following somebody based on religious beliefs, and believe someone based upon their words and based upon their doctrine. And quit listening to Hebraic roots teachers who just want to change the words of Paul to fit their own theology. So anyway, I thank you for listening, and I bid you shalom.